Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Cassandra Murray, and I am a doctoral student at the CUNY Graduate Center and a writing fellow here at Hostos Community College. Here with me today is Professor Kristopher Burrell, Associate Professor of History in the Behavioral and Social Sciences Department at Hostos. Professor Burrell has published in the Western Journal of Black Studies, Radical Teacher, and the Journal of Southern History. He is an associate editor of Ethnic Studies Review and a contributor to Strange Careers of the Jim Crow North, Segregation and Struggle Outside the South, published by NYU Press, and Developing Educational Technology at an Urban Community College, published by Palgrave Macmillan. He is currently at work on a study of New York City's civil rights movement titled Outsmarting Racism, New York's Black Intellectuals and Theorizing Northern Racism, 1945 to 1968. He has been kind enough to speak with me today about anti-racist teaching. Welcome, Professor Burrell, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Of course, I really appreciate it. So just to start off the conversation, I wanted to bring in what I think is an important quote from Paulo Freire's seminal text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he wrote, "There's no such thing as neutral education. Education either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity or freedom." And in the research I've been doing, it really seems that one of the most important goals of anti-racist teaching should be the pursuit of freedom for all. So I'd love to just found our conversation with that in mind today. And I'd really like to just ask your thoughts. And to start off by asking, how do you incorporate anti-racist practices into your own teaching and research?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I try to do a couple of things that I think are really important for students, not just in the learning of U.S. history, which is what I teach, but in for their education more broadly and for their lives beyond Hostos, obviously. One of the things that I believe is most important that I always try to emphasize for my students is learning how to ask relevant questions and to question the things that they are reading and seeing and hearing around them. And for me, it starts out with trying to emphasize what I learned as called the habits of mind. Okay. So these were, sort of five questions, five pillars of critical thinking that I, over the course of the semester, try to ingrain in students as, a sort of humanistic scientific method in a way. Questions such as, how does this relate to other things? Whose viewpoint are we getting here? What is your proof? Why is this important? What if some variable were different? How might that change the outcome of what we're looking at? And if I can get students to consistently, without having been prompted, to ask these questions of the things that they are encountering, then they are going to inevitably sort of systematically become better questioners and more critical consumers of the information that they are taking in. So I think being able to ask a good question, and for me as a professor, remembering that students have to be taught how to ask good questions, that this is not necessarily something that is ingrained in us beyond the question of why, right? Which is a question that toddlers are really, really great at asking, and it is the sort of the foundation of all great questions to follow. But oftentimes I have found that I think throughout our lower educational levels, students, what happens is that they're systematically taught or told not to ask that most fundamental question. So by the time they get to us, and by the time they get to me, I'm trying to get them to ask that question, right? And variations of that question more and more again. And I think that ability to question effectively is very empowering, right? And very liberating.
Yeah.
The other thing that I really emphasize, more in terms of the content of my classes is that I really emphasize to students that we're going to focus a lot on looking at policies and laws and the structure of our society in order to be able to understand what systemic discrimination is in the context of US history, how it has functioned, and hopefully getting students to recognize the ways in which it still exists in our society. And I think that, part of anti-racist teaching is about teaching students to understand what and how structural discrimination has functioned and continues to function within our society. Because if you can't identify something, then you can't dismantle it, exactly. Right? So being able to get students to name what is happening, to identify it, and then talk about not only people in our, historic past, but how then perhaps they can contribute to the dismantling of those systems and structures.
On maybe a more sort of technical level, I'm wondering how, if you were to define anti-racist teaching, what you might have to say about it.
I think that part of anti-racist teaching, and this has been something that has become even more central to my thinking and my teaching over the past few years, is the building and the reinforcement and the teaching of empathy among students, for other people. And I think it's one of the things that makes the learning of history so important, is being able to see the world through the perspective, or from the perspective of someone else or from another group of people. And that quality is increasingly lacking, I feel, within our broader society. And so I think that part of anti-racist teaching is focused on getting people to understand the world, or at least their world, from the perspective of others. And that trying to, one, realize that, you're not the only person in the world, or that your point of view on certain issues are not the only views out there. Even if it winds up, sort of strengthening what you previously believed, at least sort of encountering and interrogating other points of view, I think is really, really important, and an anti-racist practice.
I really appreciate your emphasis on tying what's happening in the classroom to what's happening in the larger society. And I think that's something we talk about a lot in WEC pedagogy as well, is how do we incorporate students' lives into their writing.
As I think about my classes each semester, even though I teach more or less the same, set of classes over the course of an academic year, trying to stay somewhat up to date with current scholarship, outside of my field, and, thinking about how new, at least historical literature, may have to change the way that I am, talking about a particular topic, and how changing one element of my course may very well have these ripple effects in other things also needing to be changed in order to remain true to this anti-racist ethos.
Absolutely.
But that I can also, because being a Black male in academia, both take advantage of that in certain instances in terms of the ways that I communicate particular concepts to students, but also recognize where that very well may put me at a disadvantage in trying to relay some ideas as well. So,
I think talking about being open to change and evolution is a really nice way to possibly end this interview, but I wanted to see if there's anything else that you wanted to add.
I guess, I would add that it really is important that these types of ideas do actually permeate an entire institution, our entire institution. That it is not really enough for this to be happening in the odd classroom.
Yes.
Because then your class appears aberrant, right? To the rest of them at the college or whatever institution. But that ideally, in order to create an anti-racist institution, that these ideas and other complementary ideas really need to be weaved and embedded throughout the entire institution, right, at every level, administrative, academic, staff, and when that is how you create a culture. And so I would hope, and I think that Ostos has been moving more and more in this direction, but I think for any institution, the goal needs to be creating an anti-racist culture on campus, and one that everyone understands continually needs to be nourished, right, in order for it to function. That none of this will occur or be sustained just on its own or inevitably, but rather it is the result of continual work, continual improvement that is incremental, but will ultimately hopefully be accelerated.
Yes.
As more and more parts of the institution move in the same direction.
Yes, absolutely. What specifically in your mind are some particular steps a university or institution can take to make their campus community anti-racist?
Well, I mean, I think I would go back to what I said about empathy, and steps that can be taken to foster a culture of empathy on campus, and that may mean faculty workshops around questions such as that. It might mean, a new sort of course requirement for students where, faculty may be able to get their courses, I don't want to, certified maybe a little bit too too formal, but somehow recognized as, infusing sort of principles of empathy sort of into them, and really continuing to hold the line, at least in terms of academic, higher educational institutions, holding the line and saying that students absolutely need a well-rounded sort of liberal arts education, one that doesn't shortchange the humanistic studies, even if the students' intentions are to go into a more technical or scientific field, and that those courses shouldn't be exempted, right, from discussing sort of humanistic topics within them, because those are also very fundamental and foundational in the quote unquote hard sciences. You think about the persecution of, scientific visionaries throughout history as just, some very obvious examples, but these people are also really trying to understand the world, in more complete ways. So how do we infuse, humanistic questions into the learning of, scientific or more technical fields? So those are some things I think that are important. But then also, continuing to, or maybe, continuing to discuss the salience of discrimination of different types, but also the resistance against discrimination, right? So that students continually understand the give and take, the struggle, both to oppress, but also to resist that oppression and to pursue liberation, different types of liberation as well. Like that, we need to, at least in terms of US society, and this is partly what I'm arguing in the book that I'm writing, completely sort of reframe ideas of patriotism so that we center those social movement people who were critiquing the United States in an effort to improve it, right? In an effort to make the United States live up to its rhetorical promises. And so not the people who actually just wrote the words or said the words, but the people who did the work in order to actually make the United States into the country that it proclaims itself to be. And when you start to reframe patriotism around those people, you get a much, much broader and more diverse set of historical figures through which to focus. And then you start to get a more complete and comprehensive version of US history that is actually much more hopeful, actually much more representative, and actually much more accurate. So it's quite amazing how all of those things can actually come together when you start to think of patriotism in terms of struggling to make the country into what it says it is, or what it purports itself to be.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate your time, and I hope that we can continue these conversations throughout the next semester and the upcoming years, because they are such important conversations that we keep going.
I love that. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Professor Burrell.